Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thanks for being here. A wild, tumultuous week in BC politics, starting with the threat of a snap election and dissipating from there, which is one of the topics we'll be discussing this week, as well as the BC Conservatives wrestling with what to do if there was a snap election, and gas prices, a big political issue. What can governments do about that, if anything? To break it all down, we're going to bring in the pod squad. Angelo, Isidorou, Jillian, Oliver, Jeff Ferrier are here. Thank you for being here each and every week to walk us through stuff. This was a week that we have to talk about because at Monday, we thought maybe we were heading to some type of early election. The Premier had a confidence vote on the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act amendments, put out there publicly that he was going to do this, and then he had to back down. That's where we're going to start. I try to figure out, Jeff, how this occurred. We'll start with you on this. It looks like the Premier didn't check his caucus to see if he had the votes to do this before he declared it. But what did you take away from this back down from the Premier?
Yeah, watchers and listeners will know that I predicted that this would happen this week. But look, the Premier's challenged by the need to make tough choices in a caucus where one vote means he can't advance his agenda. You know, at the best of times, governing is about the hard calls that no one wants to make. But it's especially true, it looks like, in a bare majority government where every MLA in your caucus essentially has the balance of power. When things go right, it works really well. And we've seen that happen with most of the legislation the NDP's brought forward. But when it doesn't, it's like two people trying to carry a couch through a doorway. One says shift left, the other one says shift right, and then you end up getting stuck. And I think that's where the NDP's right now. It's stuck in the doorway on this issue. And the challenge now is to find a way to get things unstuck and back moving forward.
Yeah. Angelo, the Premier saying he's not going to proceed with this as a confidence vote, and he's sort of delaying the DRIPA legislation until whenever, some other point during the session, because Joan Phillip, in an MLA from Vancouver Mount Pleasant, in his caucus, married to Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, would not vote with him on DRIPA. What did you take away from that?
Well, and it may be many more, right? Some reports, I think Katie DeRosa said that it was up to 10 MLAs potentially that were not on board with this. I mean, it's odd that he would make it a confidence motion to begin with. To me, it seemed like it was an attempt to sort of whip caucus into shape. But it just reminds me of sort of the 5 stages of grief where he was in denial about not having the votes. In fact, he said he was confident that he had the votes in several circumstances. And then Joan Phillip came out. And then it sort of, trickled off from there. It does seem as though he did not consult his caucus on whether this was reasonable. But if you're the Premier, you're in a very difficult spot right now because you see your approval ratings going down. You see how big of an issue DRIPA is, and the majority of British Columbians want it gone. So either you do nothing and continue sort of this slow political death, or you try to pass some legislation to try and satiate the issue or at least punt it down the road. But then you're held in this political hostage situation by a minority of your caucus who are going to hold you to that position that'll inevitably probably end your career. So the Premier's in a very tough spot as far as I could tell, but it was a real roller coaster for the province.
I'm kind of amazed. I'm not sure what is worse, that the Premier didn't have the votes to do this, or that there's upwards of 10 MLAs in his caucus who think doing nothing on DRIPA is the position to get behind. I'm not sure what public mood they're reading or even the legalities of doing something on DRIPA, but that's an incredible section of the NDP caucus with a very particular position that I'm not sure is really a great one. But Jillian, what do you make of this?
Well, I think in some ways it makes sense that there would be so much internal opposition. This was an NDP initiative. It's a big part of Premier John Horgan's legacy. You have the former minister who was the minister when it was implemented saying it should stay in place. And many MLAs that were around during those days when this was first passed. So it makes sense that in addition to all of the First Nations opposition, that they would want to stand by it. I think doing nothing is not the right move. That's how we got here. The original DRIPA legislation really is like an enabling legislation, and where I think the NDP has really stumbled is on the implementation and on building the infrastructure to expedite negotiations, to be more proactive, and to get more treaties across the line so that people can have more clarity about what this actually looks like in practice. We saw 2 treaties announced this week. Those are the first ones since 2007 in almost 20 years. They were started negotiating in 1994. So this process has been really, really slow. And while the premier has been on the defensive, he's just been failing to articulate a positive vision for what the implementation of DRIPA really looks like. And I think that's why you see him kind of repeatedly getting forced into these climb downs.
Mm-hmm. He's in a position where no one's happy with what he's doing, Jeff. He's got First Nations leaders telling him don't change DRIPA. He's got the opposition saying scrap DRIPA. He's got diversity in his caucus on it. His current path appears to be saying he'll delay the bill, take the confidence vote off of it, try to find other MLAs to support it, and then pass it, and then consult with First Nations again, but not the First Nations Leadership Council, which he said is not meeting him halfway. He's going to take it to 200 rights and title holders, chiefs directly. What do you make of that path forward for the premier?
So that's a great election pamphlet that you've just read out there. It's kind of clear.
It's right on a lawn sign.
Yeah, it's perfect. Look, it's not as easy as pick a lane on these issues, because every action, every move the government makes has real consequence. And we've seen that in the way First Nations have reacted to the premier trying to find a middle ground. And clarifying matters in the Supreme Court seems like the prudent policy choice, but it's not easy to communicate. But one thing is clear is that ripping up DRIPA for political reasons, which is one option they have, would make things worse. The choice isn't really stuck with the NDP and the current approach and unstuck with getting rid of DRIPA. It's stuck with the NDP and massively more stuck with the Conservatives. So you repeal reconciliation laws like the Conservatives want. The only businesses that will benefit from this are lawyers, because every project, every permit will end up before the courts, where, by the way, BC always seems to lose.
Damn those lawyers. I knew I should have gone to law school. Angelo.
Same.
What do you think of the sort of path the premier has to walk now?
Well, I think reconciliation existed before DRIPA, and it's going to exist after. Ultimately, what we know is that the majority of British Columbians they think it's gone too far at the very least, if not want it gone. So if you're the premier, I think what I want to note is what he tried to do with his sort of second amendment or second rollout, which is let's punt this down the road. Basically, let's delay this. Let's push it past the election, because I think internally he knows that when there is polling done that talks about DRIPA and associates him with it and his government with it, the NDP does not do well. It is perceived as a chaotic government. So if you're in his situation, again, I think he's in an incredibly difficult situation, because he effectively has to sit there and watch his approval ratings continue to go down, all the while what seems like a minority of his own caucus are telling him not to do anything. So I've predicted it before, but I don't think the Conservatives are going to be running against David Eby in the next election. I think they'll ultimately try to switch him out.
Jillian, the idea that the premier is going to negotiate with 200 rights and title holders because the First Nations Leadership Council, he says, isn't willing to kind of come to the table and talk about doing something on DRIPA. I don't know how you negotiate with 200 individual chiefs like that, but that seems like that might be a problem for him as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's got George Abbott now, so that maybe is going to become his problem. I think that it might be time for the premier to get out of the way a little bit on this and start delegating to his other ministers. Eby has run the premier's office very tightly. Really, since he assumed the leadership, he really quickly consolidated that role in that race and kind of got any opposition quickly out of the way, and then has kind of ruled in a very centralized fashion. And I think that maybe it's time to rethink that approach and to start delegating to his ministers, to the AG and to the Minister Chandra Herbert, because you just can't do it all, and it's obvious that his approach isn't working. Focus on other things, try to get more infrastructure in place to get trees across, and try to have something proactive to show for it by the next election, regardless of who's leader.
That would be a seismic shift in how this government is done, delegation outside the premier's office. But yeah, interesting point there. Okay, we're going to leave it here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we are going to talk about the BC Conservative reaction to all of this early election speculation right after this. Well, welcome back. We're going to talk about the BC Conservatives now with the threat of a snap election, which has dissipated. There was a lot of talk inside the Conservatives on how to handle the ongoing leadership race on May 30th, if there's a vote before then, if there should be, if there shouldn't be. But basically, it comes down to this. If there's an early election, should the current interim leader, Trevor Halford, lead the party into that election? And what if he wins and becomes premier? Does he then give up the premiership afterwards to a new leader elected later, which would be a heck of a story? That would be quite something to see. Anyways, before we get into that, Angelo, I know you're on the leadership committee for the party. You're not going to wade too far into this, but where are we at in the race and the numbers, and just kind of bring us up to speed there?
Well, tomorrow's a big day. Tomorrow is the deadline to become a member of the party if you wish to
April
vote.
18th.
That's April 18th at 5 p.m. So what I suspect will happen, and right now we're just shy of 35,000 members, I suspect we may even reach 40,000 members, which would make the Conservative Party the largest sort of membership in the province. So the leadership campaigns are very, very active and very eager to sign up people to the party and to join the party. The memberships are $25 each, so it's certainly been a very healthy source of revenue for the party and our operations. So after that, we go into the persuasion phase of the race, where you GOTV and you try to convince people to come out and vote for you. But there's also a very strict verification process in order to vote. And I think that sort of leads a little bit into what you discussed around the possibility of an early election, of what exactly would happen. Can the Conservatives basically hold an emergency vote or a sped up vote versus going into the election with Trevor? This all depends on timing. I will say there is at least one precedent that I'm aware of. In 1952, I think the Socreds won an election with an interim leader, and I believe W.A.C. Bennett was appointed as the premier afterwards. But it's not
Simpler
1952.
Times.
Simpler
No,
times, right?
no,
The Westminster system where, caucus just decides who the premier is going to be. Definitely simpler times. So
okay,
it's complicated, right?
Yeah, it is complicated. Jillian, Carolyn Elliott comes out and says, if there's an early election, we need to move the leadership vote up to right away. Peter Millibar comes out and says, if we do that, we waste the first week of an election campaign on a leadership vote. We can't do that. All the other candidates start wading in. What did you take away from this sort of internal fight in the Conservatives?
Is certainly complicated, I think, is the right word for it, because I think that Millibar has a point. Having the first week of an election, a snap election campaign, when people's opinions are really going to start forming with early voting in elections, there really isn't a lot of time until you get to that point, and the first week is really, really critical. So but on the other hand, having the public elect someone potentially as premier that then almost immediately steps down, and handing the premiership vote for the entire province to a group of 30 to 40,000 people that can't be increased is also problematic. So I don't think that there's like a perfect answer. That being said, I mean, it was like really obvious to me that there wasn't actually going to be an election. I think we're all kind of like addicted to the like adrenaline rush that we get from like pretending that there's going to be one. But like, I think it was a pretty big self-own for Elliott to come out so strongly and sort of demand this of the leadership committee, because it just looks so self-serving and it really undermines the sort of like unity vibe that a lot of people I think have been hoping for within the party. Halford's been doing a good job, and I think it was kind of like an unnecessary dig at him when it was so unlikely that they were going to go to an election this week.
She was the only one with that position by the end of everyone waiting in. Everyone else said Halford should bring the government down and run and figure it out afterwards. Jeff, what do you think of all this?
Well, for me, private ambition is what motivates Elliott's wanting to get Halford out. Every Conservative candidate, and I've watched the debates and I've watched on social media, they say the single most important thing that you can do to make BC better is to bring down the NDP. And to those who say, do it at the first opportunity, make Trevor Halford the leader, let's get them out. That's clear, that's honest. I don't agree with you, but it passes a basic public interest test. But to those who say only once I'm leader, you're telling British Columbians it's not about them, it's about you and the power you want. And that is that when the curtain is pulled back, you're not who you say you are. You're the BC Conservative Wizard of Oz.
Interesting. Okay. All right. It's a, I think you're all correct in that the likelihood of an early election now has gone far, far away. But for a moment, everyone was paralyzed by this earlier this week and waiting to see what would happen. And this was one of the discussions about it. Okay. We're going to pause here. We're going to come back with our last topic this week, which is gas prices and the politics around that after this. Welcome back. Gas prices way up because of the U.S. war in Iran, leading Prime Minister Mark Carney to announce a suspension of the federal fuel excise tax on gas until Labor Day, dropping the price, he says, by 10 cents a liter. Clearly, the Prime Minister leading into this affordability message is one of his first announcements right after winning his majority government in by-elections. The BC government says, we're not going to cut any of the provincial taxes that are on gasoline. And everyone was talking about that as they go to fill up their cars this week. Jeff, we're going to stick with you here and bring you in on this one. Was it a good move by the federal government to cut the federal excise tax? And B, should the BC government be doing something on this file as well?
I don't think the federal government should have cut the federal excise tax. What I think the federal government should have done was to put a cap on high gas prices, make it so that the oil and gas companies had to pay for the windfall profits and the high prices they're charging people, and not have that money come away from important public services. In BC, cutting gas taxes would hurt transit and it would hurt a Prince George refinery. We have two tax cuts that we can make of gas. One is revenue for roads and transit. The other is for something called the low carbon fuel, and getting that into gas tanks and sell that to folks in gridlock. And someone tell Prince George MLAs Rosalind Bird, Sheldon Clare, and Kyle Giddens that you're going to really hurt Prince George's renewable diesel refinery and put many of those employees out of work. So I think the government is right to keep gas taxes in place. And it ought to be Ottawa asking for oil and gas companies to we need to tax those excess windfall profits and give that money back to Canadians into their pockets to help them with affordability.
Yeah. Jillian, the idea here from the BC government has always been, if it cuts any of its taxes, the oil companies are just going to swoop in and eat up that profit margin because you can't trust oil and gas companies, which maybe they have a point, and I think might match the public sentiment. But do you think the BC government should have moved at all on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's not just they might have a point. That's exactly what happened when they cut the carbon tax. So like we've got really recent history proof of that being exactly the behavior of oil and gas companies. The other thing I think is like the prices on oil and gas are high because of the reality of the world and the ability of, forces far outside of our control to choke off supply for their own reasons. And to the extent that people are struggling with affordability, we should be looking elsewhere to give people relief. BC can't afford it right now. We have like zero room in the treasury whatsoever. But federally, I would rather have seen Carney go after the child tax benefit or something else like that helps families, because really we need to be shifting to EVs. We need to probably be looking at reinstating the provincial rebates that were canceled. The federal ones are still in place, and there's been an uptick in interest in EVs and hybrids because of these taxes. And we can't just keep getting into the same problem and keeping the price of gas artificially low when we need to be learning the lesson that the price signal from the market is telling us that we need to hasten our transition to electric.
1.3 billion in provincial tax revenue from gas prices at a $13 billion deficit year. That would be a hit to the budget for sure. Angelo, what did you think? The Prime Minister really leaning into affordability. Not only was this announcement, but he had offered like $8 billion to Ontario to bring down the price of homes. Like, he's clearly seeing something there that he's acting on for a reason, not so much here in BC.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what his ambitions are, despite now securing a majority. I mean, look, it's 10 cents a liter. What we know is that if we did the same here, according to the CFIB, it would be up to 27 cents a liter. People are hurting right now, and people associate their vehicle and their fuel with really the core of what is hitting them in affordability. And I think if we had a magic wand and we went, not even back to the BC Liberal days, let's just say to John Horgan, with his budget and his economy and his surplus, would we have the room to do something here? I think that it's one thing to say that we just don't have the room, but I think what matters here is that we're in an economic situation where we have a government that, yes, cannot control the American shenanigans of blockades in the Middle East, or the Iranian shenanigans for that matter. But what we can control is how we handle our own money, and how did we get here to such a place where we can't actually afford to give people this relief. Mm-hmm. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well, in terms of course, if you cut $1.5 billion out of the budget, that's going to affect things. But the fact that we can't do it, I think, needs to be a key component of how this economy has shaped out.
Okay, great. Thank you to the panel for walking us through all these topics this week. Make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast where we're doing our political plays of the week. That's available on all your audio podcast streams. Thank you to Jeff, Angelo, and Jillian for being here. And thank you for watching. And we'll see you next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.